Rejoice, O Isaiah, our virgin is with child, and shall bear a son, Emmanuel. He is both God and man, and Orient is his name. Magnifying him we call the Virgin Blessed.
The Christian Church, both in the East and in the West, has long been concerned about marriages between members of the faithful and those outside the fold. It is feared that these religiously mixed marriages would result in the loss of the true faith by the Orthodox party. As a result, church authorities have frequently intervened to enact norms to discourage, to forbid, and even at times to threaten with invalidity such religiously mixed marriages. One such intervention occurred at the Council of Trullo in 691, which was summoned by the Emperor Justinian II to enact disciplinary decrees to complete the work of the Third Council of Constantinople. Although a handful of bishops from Latin regions were present at this council, the majority of the 228 attending were from the East. Among the 102 canons enacted by Trullo, one, Canon 72, addressed the issue of marriages between the Orthodox, small o, and heretics. It said, an Orthodox man is not permitted to marry a heretical woman, nor any Orthodox woman to be joined to a heretical man. But if anything of this kind appears to have been done by any, we require them to consider the marriage null, and that the marriage be dissolved. The canons of Trullo were not immediately recognized by the Holy See, the Roman See, in part, no doubt, because many Latins took umbrage at what they perceived as the anti-Western tone of some of these canons. Nevertheless, at the local council of Troy in 878, Pope John VIII did accept those canons of Trullo which were not contrary to the ancient canons and decrees of Rome or good morals. In the opinion of most Catholic commentators, at least, this acceptance was sufficient to give Canon 72 of Trullo recognition as an authentic part of Eastern law. The Trullan discipline and its refusal of ecclesial recognition to mixed marriages may seem quite harsh, but it was not notably harsher than some legislation in the West during the same era. Trullo's Canon 72 has never been abrogated formally by authorities of the Eastern churches, either before or after the great falling out between the East and the West in 1054. But the rigor of the canon has gradually been mitigated in pastoral practice. Eastern approaches to law and to changes in the law are rather different than the highly formalized legal, some would say legalistic, approaches of Latin canonists. And these are differences that have not always been recognized and adequately appreciated by Latins. For For Eastern Christians, laws like those enacted at Trullo, which were established by an ecumenical council, cannot simply be abandoned or changed, but oikonomia leads the Church to adjust the earlier discipline to take account of particular contemporary circumstances. Such was the historical fate of Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo. Although it is difficult to trace the evolution of this discipline in the several Eastern churches, it can be said with certainty that by the 19th century, the practice of the churches of the East was to recognize the marriages between the Orthodox and heretics as long as they were celebrated with the blessing of the priest after appropriate assurances to preserve the faith of the Orthodox party and any children that might issue from the marriage. Nevertheless, beginning in 1958, there was a sudden upsurge in interest in Canon 72 of Trullo, especially in the United States, since it seemed to offer a quick and easy way to effect a pastoral solution to irregular marriage situations. This renewed interest in the Council of Trullo among Catholics was quite brief, less than 15 years in total, and it is largely forgotten today, thankfully. It is worth recalling, however, because of the window it provides on the struggle within the Catholic Church to bring traditional ways of thinking about the source and nature of governance authority in the Church and the relationship between the Catholic Church and non-Catholic churches, especially those of the East, into line with the new way of thinking, or to use Paul VI's phrase, the novus habitus mentis, brought in by the Second Vatican Council. What one might call the Trullan moment in Catholic matrimonial jurisprudence marks a shift from an arrogant, near rejection of the authentic ecclesial reality of the non-Catholic Eastern churches to a somewhat hesitant acknowledgement of their full ecclesial reality and their capacity to govern themselves legitimately. In June of 1958, the Bishop of Cleveland sent to what was then the Holy Office, now the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, an inquiry about how to proceed with a case received by his tribunal involving a Russian Orthodox man who had married a baptized Protestant before a Baptist minister in 1928, and who, after receiving a civil divorce, was seeking to marry a Catholic woman. The Holy Office referred the case to the then Congregation for the Oriental Church, which replied not that the marriage was invalid because of the failure of the Orthodox man to receive a priestly blessing for the union, but that the bishop, quote, could apply to the marriage without fear of error Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo, since it has not been proved that this canon cannot be applied to Byzantines of Slavonic rite. Although this response was not published by any official source, news of it got around in canonical circles in the United States and was eagerly latched onto by tribunals especially those in areas with heavy concentrations of Eastern European immigrants. As a result, between 1958 and 1967, a number of cases, mostly from the United States, were referred sometimes to the Holy Office and sometimes to the Congregation for the Eastern Church to inquire whether marriages of Orthodox and Protestants could be declared invalid because of the diriment impediment of mixed religion. After the reallocation of curial competences by Paul VI, the apostolic delegate to the United States sent a letter to all diocesan bishops in this country in January of 1967, which authorized them to deal with cases involving the so-called Trulin impediment in trials in their own tribunals, and to use the normal appellate system for second and subsequent instances. From the time the first reported case involving Trullo's Canon 72 in 1958 until 1968, all of the cases, at least all of those that have been reported, ended in decisions that, despite the contrary practice of the Orthodox churches themselves, Orthodox communicants were bound by Trullo's impediment of mixed religion, and that marriages entered into in violation of that canon could be summarily declared invalid. However, as was and still is typical of such responses from the Roman congregations, the responses were silent about the legal reasoning underlying these decisions. Nonetheless, it is not impossible to identify the eminence grise whose scholarship provided a basis for these decisions. In 1959, Acacius Cardinal Cusa, longtime assessor for the Congregation for the Oriental Church and a noted expert in Oriental canon law, published an article in the Roman journal Apollinaris, in which he insisted on the continued validity of the norm of the Council of Trullo for Orthodox. His argument has been summarized in 6 points. First, Canon 72 of the Synod of Trullo makes mixed religion a diriment impediment, invalidating the marriages of an Orthodox and a heretic. 2, this canon originally bound the entire Byzantine Church. 3, the popes have consistently vowed to uphold Oriental canon law. 4, there is no record of an explicit papal abrogation of this canon. 5, the dissident hierarchy has no jurisdiction to change the impediment. 6, therefore, it was still in force for the Orthodox until it was formally abrogated by Pius XII's motu proprio Crebrae Alate in 1949 that began the process of codifying Eastern canon law. The critical premise in this argument, that the hierarchs of the Orthodox churches had no jurisdiction to change the discipline, depends on a position once widely held in Catholic theology and canon law that all ecclesiastical power of governance or jurisdiction derives from the Roman pontiff by legitimate canonical mission. a mission that the pontiff is free to revoke. If one accepts this opinion, then it follows that once the Catholic and Orthodox churches went their separate ways, the hierarchies of the Orthodox churches no longer had legitimate canonical missions from the Pope. As a result, they lacked the authority to alter Canon 72 of Trullo directly, to dispense from it in particular cases, or to give the force of law to customs contrary to the law that seem to have emerged in Orthodox communities. Thus, Orthodox who married heretics, including Protestants, prior to 1949, did so invalidly. Cusa's claim that Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo had been abolished for Eastern Christians, both Catholic and Orthodox, by Pius XII's motu proprio in 1949 was soon challenged. And after a long bit of wrangling in the congregations of the Roman Curia, his view was rejected. As a result, cases involving the impediment could be entertained by Catholic tribunals, even if the marriage under challenge occurred after 1949. As cases involving this impediment began to arrive in the Roman Rota, the judges began to deal with the cases on appeal. In the meantime, the underlying premise of Cusa's argument for the continuing validity of Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo seems to have been fatally undermined by the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. In its decree in 1964 on Ecumenism Unitatis Redingratio, the Council taught, and I quote, "To remove all shadow of doubt, this Holy Synod solemnly declares that the churches of the East, while keeping in mind the necessary unity of the whole Church, have the power to govern themselves according to their own discipline, since these are better suited to the character of the faithful and better adapted to foster the good of souls." The language of this conciliar decree suggests that the authority of the churches of the East to govern themselves is not something conceded to them recently by the Roman Pontiff, but something they have enjoyed all along. The decree on ecumenism did not expressly explain the basis for its acknowledgement of the jurisdiction of Eastern bishops. The Council had, however, already prepared the ground for this acknowledgement in its treatment of governance authority of bishops in the dogmatic constitution Lumen Gentium, which was promulgated along with the decree on ecumenism on the same day, November 21st, 1964. In Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council embarked on an effort to reconceptualize the source and nature of jurisdiction or power of governance in the Church. Traditional Catholic theology and canon law in the West, since the Middle Ages, had conceived orders and jurisdiction as two distinct powers within the Church, each with its own source and function. The power of orders derived from sacred ordination and empowered its recipient to perform sanctifying functions. The power of jurisdiction, on the other hand, derived from canonical mission and empowered its recipient to teach and govern with authority. While the power of orders was personal and could never be lost or revoked, the power of jurisdiction ceased with the termination or withdrawal of the canonical mission. Clergy tended to have the monopoly on both powers, but these powers were understood as quite distinct and, at least in principle, separable. As a result, you had the strange phenomenon in medieval Germany of prince-elector bishops who never much got beyond first tonsure, who governed their churches through what they called consecration bishops, and which we in the West now call auxiliaries. In Lumen Gentium, the council also tried to bring what had traditionally been called the power of orders and the power of jurisdiction into more intimate connection than they had recently been in traditional Catholic thinking. The council said episcopal consecration, together with the office of sanctifying, also confers the offices of teaching and governing, the latter of which can be exercised only in hierarchical communion with the head and members of the College of Bishops. While the exact nature of the relationship between the power of sacred orders and the power of governance has been a subject of heated and, to date, inconclusive discussion among Catholics, the explanatory note promulgated with Lumen Gentium did make clear that for teaching and governance functions conferred at episcopal ordination to be exercised validly, the one ordained needs canonical or juridical determination by hierarchical authority, and this is given according to norms approved by the highest authority. This teaching allowed for recognition that Orthodox bishops, the validity of whose ordinations had never been in question, enjoyed the seeds or rudiments of governance authority. In turn, the conciliar recognition that ecclesial communion, including hierarchical communion, is not an either-or matter, as post-Reformation Catholic theology had often understood it, but admits of various degrees. And this allowed the Catholic Church to acknowledge that despite the rift that has existed between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches since 1054, there is real, albeit imperfect, communion between them. Lumen Gentium 24 held that canonical mission of bishops can be made by legitimate customs that have not been revoked, such as the election of bishops according to the norms of immemorial custom, as has been the case in the East. Election and real but imperfect communion could then be seen as sufficient to transfer the munus of governing conferred in ordination on Orthodox bishops into power of governance or jurisdiction ordered to action. If the Catholic Church now recognized that Orthodox churches have and always have had the power to govern themselves according to their own norms and discipline, one would have to conclude that the Orthodox churches had long ago exercised this legitimate power to eliminate the diriment impediment of mixed religion by allowing it to fall into desuetude to foster the good of souls. However, this practical consequence of conciliar teaching did not immediately translate into everyday Catholic jurisprudence. There are no reliable statistics on the number of marriage nullity cases actually decided, first by curial dicasteries and later by Catholic tribunals, on the ground of the so-called Trullan impediment of mixed religion between 1959 and 1972, but there were enough cases arising at the local level to generate a steady flow of appellate cases to the Roman Rota. In this period, a total of 19 cases were heard and decided by the Rota on this ground, all but 2 of them originating in the United States. In the first of these cases, a turnus of judges Coram Palazzini on October 24, 1967, adopted without question the reasoning that had been advanced in 1959 by Cusa, that since the Schism of 1054, Orthodox hierarchies had been bereft of jurisdiction to alter the discipline of Trullo. Thus they declared the marriage of an Orthodox man and a Lutheran woman invalid. The conciliar decree on ecumenism was not mentioned in the decision, which proceeded as if the Second Vatican Council had never occurred. In 1967 and 68, 4 more Rotal decisions declared marriages involving Orthodox parties with Protestants invalid because of Canon 72, with scant reference to the teaching of Vatican II. By 1968, the Rotal judges had become a bit more skeptical about the continued applicability of Canon 72 for judging the validity of marriages of Orthodox. In a decision, Coram de Giorio of October 17, 1968, the Rotal panel rejected the claim that the marriage between an Orthodox man and a Methodist woman was invalid because of the Trullan impediment. Although they agreed with Cusa that Protestants were clearly encompassed among the heretics with whom Orthodox were barred from entering marriage, they were quite critical of Cusa's view that since 1054 the Orthodox had lacked the authority to admit the legal force of a custom contrary to the law. However, the judges' doubts about the validity of Cusa's arguments rested more on the internal inconsistencies in these arguments and not because of their apparent conflict with the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, an event that was mentioned by De Giorio only in passing. Thus, the judges would only go so far as to hold that in their judgment there was an insoluble probable doubt of law about the continuing applicability of Canon 72 of Trullo, and that in accord with the principles of canon law, this doubtful law did not bind. This rather cautious approach was followed by several later Rotal decisions. The impact of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council could not, however, be resisted forever. The first Rotal decision to cite the teaching of Vatican II as relevant for the resolution of this issue was one Coram Abo in June of 1969. The heart of the panel's argument was that Vatican II's recognition of the right of the Eastern churches to govern themselves entailed a corresponding right of Orthodox communities to develop customs contrary to the law. Thus, they held that the binding force of Canon 72 of Trullo had been abrogated by contrary custom. However, even in 1969, the panel hedged its bets by concluding that its arguments had at least established a positive doubt of law. Jurisprudence took at least a half step backward, however, with a decision by the Apostolic Signatura in July of 1972. This decision involved a case forwarded to the Holy See by the Archbishop of Chicago involving a baptized Protestant man who married a Russian Orthodox woman and whose marriage had been declared invalid on the ground of the impediment of mixed religion. Paul VI gave the Signatura, the Church's highest tribunal, the special faculty to resolve the case in a definitive manner and as a matter of principle. After going at length into the history of the mitigation of the discipline of the Eastern churches on this issue, the Signatura concluded that, indeed, Orthodox communities had the capacity to introduce customs contrary to the law, that they had done so in this case, and that it was a reasonable custom and one that had been observed for a sufficient period of time to have the force of law. The question remaining was whether this custom, contrary to the law developed in the Orthodox churches, had received recognition or consent from the competent ecclesiastical authority, which for Cardinal Staffa and his panel of Signatura judges could only be the Roman Pontiff. The Signatura concluded that the Roman Pontiff had indeed given consent to this custom. They explained, if what has been said above about the reasonableness of these customs is recalled, it seems to us absurd to deny them legal consent. This would be the same as denying to the Orthodox every kind of faculty to revise their law in keeping with today's necessities, and the Catholic Church would be employing with the Orthodox a harshness and severity which are inexplicable and hardly in concert with the spirit with which she must look after the spiritual good of every baptized person. In other words, since it would be absurd and cruel for the Roman Pontiff not to consent to the custom of the Orthodox, he must have given consent. Perhaps because they recognized that this reasoning was more than a little bit opaque, the Signatura judgments concluded the reasons alleged above seem to prove at least a definite doubt of law concerning the invalidating force of this canon, with the result that marriages entered into between Orthodox and Protestants in general, and more particularly between Russian Orthodox and Protestants, cannot be held to be invalid. After the 1972 Signatura decision, marriage cases where Canon 72 of Council of Trullo was proposed as the ground of nullity of marriage between an Orthodox and a Protestant disappeared from Catholic tribunals. From the point of view of Catholic jurisprudence, the question of the continuing binding force of Canon 772 had been settled finally. But the reasons had not been resolved in a very satisfactory way. Although the impediment of mixed religion, defined in Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo, has not resurfaced as an issue in Catholic jurisprudence since 1972, the larger issues it raised have never entirely disappeared. The problem that was posed by this canon was only a manifestation of the larger challenge to Catholic theology and canon law of how to integrate the Catholic Church's traditional understanding of ecclesiastical authority, especially papal authority, into the conciliar understanding of the right of separated Eastern churches to govern themselves. The Signatura decision Coram Staffa had at least somewhat grudgingly acknowledged the authority of Orthodox churches to govern themselves, but it left the distinct impression that since this self-governance was exercised at the sufferance of the Roman Pontiff. What appears to be a step forward toward recognition of the autonomy and self-governing authority of the Orthodox churches was made with the promulgation in 1990 of the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches. Canon 1490 of this code makes explicit that the Roman Church has no intention, in this document at least, to legislate for anyone except the Eastern Catholic churches. In Canon 780 of this code, it goes on to say that when a Catholic tribunal must judge the validity of a case involving a non-Catholic, then it is to look to the law binding the non-Catholic. More precisely, the marriages of baptized non-Catholics are to be assessed in terms, first, of the law proper to the church or ecclesial community to which the non-Catholic belongs, if that community has its own matrimonial law. Two, the law to which the non-Catholic is subject, if the ecclesial community to which the person belongs has no matrimonial law of its own. Thus, the marriages between two Orthodox or an Orthodox and a baptized Protestant are to be considered valid or not, depending on whether they were celebrated in conformity with the divine law and the law of the Orthodox churches in force at the time of the celebration. The Catholic Church seems to have made progress since the decision of the Roman congregations in the 1950s and 60s, when the series of decisions ignored the discipline of the Eastern churches. This discipline of the Eastern Code has also been extended to the tribunals of the Latin Church by the 2005 Instruction Dignitas Connubii, which applies Canon 780 of the Eastern Code in a somewhat revised fashion to Latin tribunals. Where do we go from here? Although the current law of the Catholic Church does not pretend to legislate for Eastern Orthodox churches, but recognizes the binding force of the laws these churches have developed for their own members, it is not clear whether this hands-off approach to the law governing the Eastern Orthodox is a recognition of their genuine right to autonomous self-governance, or is simply a somewhat paternalistic concession by the Catholic Church. At the start of the modern discussion of the continuing authority of Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo, Cardinal Cusa had asserted boldly not only that since the Schism of 1054 the Orthodox had lacked jurisdiction to change the traditional discipline of the Eastern churches, but that Pius XII had in fact done so. The latter claim had been rejected. However, the reason for the rejection was not the conviction that the Roman Pontiff could not, even should not, legislate for Eastern non-Catholics if he so desired, but a studied conclusion that he had not in fact done so. This acknowledgement of the jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff over the Orthodox continued all the way to the Signatura decision of 1972. The present situation of the law, which seems to recognize the autonomy and governance authority of the Eastern churches, continues to raise the problem that is the tension between the autonomy of the Eastern churches and Catholic claims to primacy. A second problem raised is the conciliar teaching in the Constitution Lumen Gentium, and especially in its explanatory note, brought the sacred power of sacred orders and jurisdiction into a much more intimate connection than had been characteristic of Catholic thinking for almost a millennium. This intimate connection between orders and the function of or munus of governance provided the foundation for Catholic recognition of the governance authority of Orthodox hierarchs over their churches, which has continued. What raises question is the Catholic Church's recognition, both in the Eastern Code and now in the Instruction Dignitas Connubii, not only of the marriage laws of non-Catholic churches, most notably the Orthodox churches, but also the discipline on marriages of non-Catholic ecclesial communities. In Catholic theological and canonical terminology, ecclesial communities are those groupings of Christian faithful which possess some elements of the Church of Christ, but do not, at least in the judgment of the Catholic Church, possess valid sacramental orders and apostolic succession. If such communities without orders and apostolic succession are capable of developing their own norms on marriage law or accepting the force of some other marriage law, what is the source of this authority to bind the members of their community? Third, this whole episode of the momentary interest in Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo was a result of American tribunals' desperate attempt to deal with otherwise insoluble marriage situations. Pastors in North America, especially in cities with large Eastern European populations like Chicago, Cleveland, and Gary, were faced with pastoral problems. But their solution, latching on to Canon 72 of Trullo, was an example of a pastoral approach that was insulting to the one that they were trying to help, by refusing to acknowledge the genuinely ecclesial reality of the Eastern churches. Finally, the slow recognition by Catholic jurisprudence of the desuetude into which Canon 72 of the Council of Trullo had fallen in Orthodox practice, and its reluctance to acknowledge the authority of these churches to adapt their own discipline in the interest of the good of souls, pointedly illustrates how difficult it can be for centuries-old ways of thinking to be opened to new insights. As late as 8 years after the promulgation of Vatican II's decree on ecumenism, with its clear and unapologetic recognition of the right to of the Orthodox Church to govern themselves, the Apostolic Signatura, the highest tribunal in the Catholic Church, could not quite bring itself to acknowledge that the Orthodox had changed their own discipline by contrary custom without the intervention of the Roman Pontiff. This slow coming to grips with the conciliar teaching illustrates clearly the challenge that now faces Pope Francis as he tries to bring his own novus habitus mentis to the Catholic Church.
Rejoice, O